Holsag didn't just move a factory, it walked away from a legacy. For 35 years, Holsag was a staple of Canadian manufacturing. Based in Lindsay, Ontario, it built its name on quality, craftsmanship, and a label that said everything, made in Canada. That label wasn't just a geographic stamp, it was a promise. To buyers across North America, Holsag furniture stood for durability, reliability, and a connection to Canadian identity. But when tariffs hit, everything changed. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. In 2020, U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods spiked up to 30% on some items. For companies like Holsag, exporting to the United States suddenly came with a price tag that threatened their bottom line. So, in what they framed as a strategic move, Holsag shut down operations in Ontario and relocated production to Utah. The first sign of trouble came quickly. Supply chain costs ballooned. Holsag had depended heavily on Canadian materials. Relocating production to the US didn't change that, it just added distance and complexity. Cross-border freight, delays, and new logistics contracts drove costs up instead of down. The savings they expected from avoiding tariffs were eaten alive by new expenses. And U.S. labor costs, higher than projected. Instead of lowering expenses, they increased them by 8 to 10%. Infrastructure costs also surged. Retooling a new facility in Utah pushed the budget 18% over projections. Everything from training new workers to retrofitting equipment took longer and cost more than Holsag had anticipated. Lead times that used to be 3 weeks stretched to 8. Clients noticed, and many didn't wait around. Within months, the company lost up to 30% of its revenue. That wasn't a dip. That was a free fall. This wasn't just a manufacturing issue, it was a branding disaster. Holsag underestimated how much value was tied to their Canadian identity. They thought they were selling chairs and tables, but they were selling a story, reputation, connection. When that broke, so did the customer base. Meanwhile, back in Canada, the federal government responded differently. Instead of chasing business away, Ottawa doubled down on domestic resilience. The $5 billion Industrial Resilience Fund rolled out, aimed at supporting Canadian manufacturers. New procurement policies under the Buy Canadian campaign gave preference to local suppliers. Canada didn't fight tariffs with retreat, they fought with reinforcement. And it worked. While Holsag was struggling to find its footing in Utah, other Canadian firms retooled, diversified, and pivoted toward European and Asian markets. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement (CETA) gave Canadian businesses access to Europe without the baggage of U.S. protectionism. Ottawa's approach wasn't perfect, but it gave manufacturers a chance to adapt rather than abandon. Holsag's relocation, once seen as savvy, now looked like an unforced error. A cautionary tale about reacting too quickly, too narrowly, and without a full understanding of what really drives value in a brand. Tariffs were a problem, but abandoning a loyal market, trusted reputation, and national identity, that was a bigger one. The broader context makes the story even more striking. As the U.S. doubled down on the 2025 Protection Act, enforcing even more trade barriers, Canadian firms increasingly looked outward. The North American economic model, once seamless, was becoming fractured, and Holsag found itself stuck in the middle, exposed on both ends, no longer Canadian, but not fully at home in the U.S. either. Their customers didn't buy it. Their costs didn't drop. Their lead times got worse. And their story, once one of national pride, turned into a case study in what happens when you misunderstand what actually makes your business work. Holsag thought they were escaping tariffs. What they ran into was a wall of unintended consequences. Protectionism, by design, creates winners and losers. But Holsag proved that even companies trying to play the game can end up on the wrong side of it. Moving production didn't shield them from complexity, it multiplied it. Instead of being exempt from chaos, they became entangled in it. Even with U.S. operations in place, Holsag remained reliant on Canadian inputs. They were still tied to the same supply chains. Now, those supply chains just had more steps, more costs, and more room for failure. This is what experts call the Holsag paradox. The more you try to escape the effects of tariffs by jumping borders, the more you risk recreating the same problems on a larger scale. Protectionism isn't just a border tax, it reshapes the logic of business. And without a clear strategy, it can backfire. In contrast, Canada's approach showed that. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next. And you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Resilience doesn't have to mean isolation. It can mean investment. While the US built barriers, Canada built supports. And that support helped firms stabilize, innovate, and evolve without having to uproot everything. The Holsag story is a reminder: location matters. But so does identity. So does customer trust. So does operational reality. Moving a factory doesn't automatically move value with it. What Holsag learned too late is that a brand is not just a product. It's where it comes from, who it serves, how it's perceived. And once that connection is broken, you can't patch it with cheaper real estate. Holsag didn't just lose a factory, they lost the thread. What was once a proud Canadian manufacturer, known for its durability and heritage, became a cautionary tale of chasing short-term wins at the cost of long-term trust. And the worst part, they weren't the only ones watching. Other Canadian manufacturers, nervous about the escalating tariff war between Washington and Ottawa, looked to Holsag's move as a test case. Could shifting production to the US be the smart play? Could avoiding tariffs be worth the disruption? Holsag answered that question for them loudly. When the company relocated to Utah, the assumption was that they would bypass US tariffs, lower their costs, and maintain their dominance in both markets. What they underestimated fatally was the value embedded in how and where their products were made. The chairs didn't just hold weight, they carried meaning. When Holsag dropped the Made in Canada label, they weren't just changing manufacturing logistics. They were signaling to their customers that the very thing many had been buying into, the pride of Canadian craftsmanship, was no longer part of the deal. And for thousands of institutional buyers, schools, government agencies, and businesses that prioritize Canadian-made goods, that message hit hard. Contracts were canceled. Longtime clients walked away. Others slashed orders. Within months, the company saw a 25 to 30% revenue drop. That kind of hit isn't just damaging, it's destabilizing. And it wasn't because the product got worse. It was because the story got lost. Brand identity isn't a logo. It's the trust that builds over years of consistent values. Holsag spent decades positioning itself as a Canadian institution. It was a story of national reliability, quiet, consistent, dependable. But when they moved, that narrative collapsed overnight. And they didn't have a new one ready. So they were left stranded. Too Canadian for American incentives. Too American for Canadian loyalty. Stuck in a middle ground that benefited no one. And the economic costs kept mounting. Setup costs in Utah came in at 18% over budget. Equipment had to be reinstalled. Facilities had to be redesigned. Workforce training took longer than expected. And every day lost to ramp-up time meant orders delayed, customers frustrated, and competitors gaining ground. Then there were the logistics. Just because the factory had moved didn't mean the supply chain had. Holsag was still relying heavily on Canadian source materials. Transporting those across the border now without the benefit of domestic streamlining meant longer delivery times, higher freight costs, and more customs headaches. Lead times went from 3 weeks to 8. For institutional clients running on procurement schedules, that delay wasn't just inconvenient, it was unacceptable. And the worst irony, even after escaping tariffs, input costs rose between 8 to 10%. They didn't save. They spent more and lost customers in the process. That's the cost of not seeing the full picture. Because when you build a company over decades, you're not just building systems and facilities. You're building relationships, trust, market identity. And if you trade that in for a short-term fix, it doesn't come back easily, if at all. Holsag tried to navigate a protectionist storm by running from it. But Canada, on the other hand, chose to weather it. Ottawa's approach wasn't glamorous, but it was strategic. The Industrial Resilience Fund injected $5 billion into domestic manufacturers, not just in subsidies but in systems. Grants to upgrade machinery, shift toward digital infrastructure, build regional supply chains. Paired with a national Buy Canadian campaign, the government told its industries, "You don't need to run. We'll build around you." That move paid off. While Holsag was hemorrhaging clients in Utah, smaller firms in Ontario and Quebec were picking up contracts, some from the very customers Holsag had lost. That wasn't just patriotic preference. It was practical. Buyers trusted local suppliers. They trusted shorter lead times. They trusted companies that weren't trying to reorient themselves mid-crisis. Meanwhile, protectionism in the U.S. only deepened. The 2025 Protection Act pushed new tariffs on steel, aluminum, and finished goods. American policymakers said they were defending domestic jobs, but the downstream effect was more fragmentation. Canadian manufacturers, once tightly integrated with U.S. supply chains, now turned away, pivoting to Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. That continental divide is now real. Where NAFTA once promised fluid borders and open markets, 2025 looks more like a splintered landscape. And Holsag's story is a microcosm of that fracture. What used to be a shared North American ecosystem is now a battlefield of competing policies and shrinking middle ground. The consequences go beyond just one company. Because what Holsag revealed painfully is that reactionary business decisions, made under pressure, can backfire when they're not grounded in full-cost thinking. They responded to tariffs with speed, not strategy. They assumed production could be unmoored from brand, that physical relocation would bring financial relief. But in doing so, they missed the fact that the real value of their business was built on where and how they operated. The chairs didn't just hold up bodies. They held up reputations. And that's the long-term cost of protectionist whiplash. Not just in dollars, but in diminished brand equity, broken relationships, and credibility that won't be easy to repair. For companies watching this unfold, the takeaway couldn't be clearer. Survival isn't about fleeing to the cheapest factory. It's about anchoring your business in a resilient model that can absorb policy shocks. That means assessing the full supply chain, not just tariff lines. It means investing in national trust, not just international margins. And above all, it means not losing sight of who your customers think you are. Because once that image is shattered, there's no line item in the budget to fix it. Holsag's story is a lesson in how quickly a brand can unravel when it forgets what made it strong in the first place. They traded identity for relief, but relief didn't come. What did come was confusion, cost overruns, canceled orders, and a shrinking footprint in the very markets they once dominated. And even now, as Ottawa continues to bolster local industries, and as Canada's exporters establish new footholds in Europe and Asia, Holsag remains stuck, no longer the symbol it once was, and not yet anything new. This is what happens when protectionism reshapes the map, and when companies move without a compass. The Holsag fallout didn't just expose one company's misstep, it exposed an entire mindset. A mindset that says brand identity is optional. That says customers will follow you wherever you go. That says cost is king. And everything else, heritage, loyalty, place, can be negotiated down to a spreadsheet. That mindset failed. Loudly, publicly, and worst of all, predictably. Because the warning signs were there. The second Holsag walked away from Lindsay, Ontario, it walked away from everything it had spent 35 years building. The community that gave it roots. The workers who gave it consistency. The label that told buyers, "You can trust us." All of it traded for a plan that looked clever on paper, but collapsed under the weight of reality. And here's what that reality looked like. Suppliers still in Canada, costs still going up, production timelines in chaos, and a market that no longer believed in the product because the story that gave it meaning had vanished. What Holsag misunderstood was that the "Made in Canada" label wasn't just a flag. It was currency. In the world of B2B furniture, where contracts are often awarded based on trust, longevity, and national procurement policies, origin matters. Canadian schools, hospitals, and public buildings weren't just buying chairs, they were buying assurance. When that disappeared, so did the orders. Meanwhile, the US market, Holsag was trying to shield itself within not exactly stable ground. With the 2025 Protection Act kicking in, tariffs kept shifting. Labor costs were rising. Trucking and warehousing saw massive demand spikes. And Holsag, already over budget on infrastructure, was left trying to navigate a domestic market that was just as volatile as the one they had left behind. What they thought would be a refuge turned out to be another battlefield. Only now, they had less customer loyalty, less leverage, and less clarity about what they even represented anymore. And while Holsag scrambled, something else was happening. A shift. A quiet but significant movement within Canadian manufacturing. Because while the spotlight was on those leaving, many companies stayed. And with government support flowing from the Industrial Resilience Fund and the Buy Canadian campaign, staying began to look smarter. Grants to upgrade equipment, incentives for domestic procurement, export programs aimed at breaking into Europe and Asia. Suddenly, Canadian firms weren't trapped. They were adapting. And Holsag? It had cut itself out of that evolution. There's something powerful about watching a country reinforce its manufacturing backbone while another builds barriers. Ottawa bet on stability, partnership, and domestic credibility. Washington doubled down on isolation and tariffs. The result? A fragmented North American market. And a company like Holsag caught in between, no longer rooted in Canada, not fully embraced by the US, and left wondering how it all unraveled so quickly. This is where brand really shows its weight. Because when disruption hits, whether it's policy, pandemic, or economic chaos, what keeps customers with you isn't pricing. It's identity. It's trust. It's whether people believe that who you are hasn't changed, even when everything else has. Holsag proved that identity is fragile, and once it breaks, it doesn't come back just because the product is technically the same. Furniture isn't a fast-moving consumer good. It's long-cycle, reputation-driven, and rooted in dependability. You can't change the story and expect the same loyalty. And loyalty is what kept Holsag alive for decades. Other companies watched all of this unfold in real time. And what was initially seen as a bold, strategic play started to look reckless. It became a reference point for what not to do when reacting to tariffs and market pressure. Not because moving is always a mistake, but because how and why you move determines everything. In Holsag's case, the why was flawed from the start. They moved to avoid tariffs. Full stop. There wasn't a customer-led strategy. There wasn't a supply chain revamp. There wasn't a reinvention of the brand to match the relocation. It was purely reactive, get out before it gets worse. But it got worse anyway. That's the thing about reactionary decisions. They usually solve the wrong problem. This is the real cost of moving too quickly in a protectionist world. Not just logistics, not just budgets, but relevance. If this story reframed how you think about manufacturing, trade, or corporate strategy, hit the like button. Share this with someone who still believes brand identity can survive without roots. Drop a comment if you've seen a company try to chase savings and lose something deeper. And subscribe for more stories where economics, decisions, and identity collide, because in today's market, how you move matters just as much as where you land.